The cold wind of Pripyat carried an unsettling stillness as 6 tourists, fueled by a thirst for danger, followed Yuri, an enigmatic tour guide, into the decaying ghost town. Armed with Geiger counters and flashlights, they entered the irradiated ruins of Chernobyl's forgotten city. The thrill of exploring the forbidden zone quickly gave way to unease as shadows danced unnaturally in the dim glow of their flashlights. Unbeknownst to them, their every step was being tracked by something inhuman. As night fell, the group discovered mutilated animals arranged in grotesque patterns, signs of rituals etched into concrete walls. Panic gripped them when one member, Sarah, vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only a trail of blood. Yuri's warnings to stay together came too late. The survivors found her hours later, bound and displayed like a trophy in a derelict amusement park. Her lifeless body was a gruesome masterpiece, her face frozen in eternal agony. The remaining tourists realized they were not alone. From the shadows emerged the survivors of Pripyat, grotesque humanoid figures with irradiated flesh, teeth sharpened into jagged points, and bloodshot eyes that radiated madness. These creatures, once human, had become feral predators driven by centuries of torment and hunger. The group's terror escalated as the mutants began hunting them, one by one. Trapped in the crumbling remains of an abandoned hospital, Jack was the next to fall. His screams echoed as he was dragged into the darkness, his flesh stripped away piece by a cackling horde. Yuri revealed the horrifying truth. These mutants had developed a taste for human flesh, and their rituals were offerings to the spirits of the irradiated dead that haunted Pripyat. The survivors fought desperately, navigating the ruins in search of an escape. Maria, overwhelmed with terror, stumbled into a decayed school building where she found the remnants of past victims, bones stretched into crude banners. A mutilated voice whispered from the shadows, "Stay with us forever." Maria's cries were silenced as the mutants descended on her, their laughter reverberating through the empty halls. As the mutants closed in on the remaining tourists, they discovered the city itself seemed alive. Hallways twisted impossibly, Geiger counters spiked without warning, and shadows took on monstrous shapes. The radiation had corrupted more than just the inhabitants, it had fused with the essence of Pripyat, turning the city into a living, breathing nightmare. In the final act of desperation, Yuri sacrificed himself to give the last 2 survivors, David and Lisa, a chance to escape. Armed with makeshift weapons, they battled through hordes of mutants, their sanity fraying as they witnessed unspeakable atrocities. But Pripyat wasn't finished with them. The creatures drove them to the reactor's core, where the leader of the mutants, a towering, irradiated abomination with melted skin and glowing red eyes, awaited. The reactor room became a blood-soaked arena. David was impaled on rusted metal, his screams swallowed by the reactor's oppressive hum. Lisa, drenched in blood and on the brink of collapse, managed to stab the mutant leader in its molten eye. The creature's death triggered a violent explosion, shaking the ruins of Pripyat. Lisa stumbled out of the city alone, her body battered and mind shattered. As she reached the edge of the exclusion zone, she glanced back. In the distance, the mutants watched, their glowing eyes promising she would never truly escape. Pripyat had claimed her soul, and its horrors would haunt her forever. The authorities found Lisa days later, delirious and covered in radiation burns. Her warnings were dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman. Lisa's rescue was far from salvation. She was rushed to a facility outside the her body racked with radiation poisoning and her mind teetering on the edge of madness. The doctors who tended to her began to notice strange burns on her skin that resembled the crude symbols she'd seen carved into the walls of Pripyat. Her screams echoed through the sterile halls as she recounted the horrors she had endured. Unbeknownst to the hospital staff, Lisa wasn't alone. The survivors of Pripyat had marked her as one of their own. The radiation wasn't just poisoning her body, it was transforming her. Strange whispers filled her head, urging her to return to the city. At night, she clawed at the walls, her nails tearing and bleeding as she drew the same horrifying symbols from Pripyat's ruins. The staff dismissed her as delusional, but one nurse, Natalia, began to notice disturbing signs, flickering lights, shadows moving unnaturally, and a growing sense of dread around Lisa's room. One stormy night, Lisa disappeared. Security footage showed her walking barefoot into the darkness, her eyes glowing faintly. But she wasn't alone. Moments later, the facility was plunged into chaos. The mutants had followed her, drawn to their prey like moths to a flame. They tore through the hospital with savage precision, sparing no one. Natalia was dragged into the morgue, where she was bound to a rusted autopsy table. The mutants performed their sickening rituals, carving the symbols of Pripyat into her flesh as she screamed. Her cries swallowed by the thunder outside. Meanwhile, Lisa, now fully under Pripyat's spell, led the mutants toward the nearby town. The creatures spread like a plague, slaughtering anyone in their path. One family barricaded themselves in their home, but it was no use. The mutants broke through the windows, ripping the father apart while forcing the mother and child to watch. They left the bodies in grotesque displays, warning anyone who dared to follow. Back in Pripyat, Lisa returned to the reactor core, where the mission was nearly complete. Her skin was pale and cracked, her eyes glowing with radioactive fury. The leader marked her as their queen, a conduit between the cursed city and the outside world. The few survivors from the nearby town who escaped the mutants' rampage banded together, determined to fight back. Armed with hunting rifles and Molotov cocktails, they tracked Lisa and the mutants to Pripyat. The journey into the city was a descent into hell. They encountered endless traps, rusted metal spikes, irradiated pools of water, and the ever-present glow of radioactive fog. One by one, the survivors fell to the mutants' ambushes. A man named Victor was dragged into an abandoned school and tortured. His screams echoing as the mutants peeled the flesh from his bones. His companions found him hours later, his body strung up like a warning. Only two remained, Natalia, who had escaped the hospital, and Dmitri, a grizzled hunter with nothing left to lose. Natalia and Dmitri reached the reactor, where Lisa's ascension was nearly complete. The mutants had created a throne of bones and twisted metal, and Lisa sat atop it, her humanity long gone. The mutant leader raised its arms, summoning the spirits of Pripyat to fuse with Lisa's corrupted soul. In a desperate attempt to stop the ritual, Natalia hurled a Molotov cocktail at the reactor core, igniting a massive explosion. The mutants screamed as the fire consumed them. But Lisa remained untouched, her power growing. Dmitri charged at her, only to be impaled by jagged metal shards that erupted from the ground. Natalia, now alone, faced Lisa in a final showdown. Armed with nothing but a knife, she lunged at the former tourist, her rage outweighing her fear. The two women fought viciously, their blood mixing with the toxic air. Natalia managed to stab Lisa through the chest, but the wound only seemed to empower her. With a guttural scream, Lisa threw Natalia into the reactor's control, shattering her spine. As the reactor began to collapse, Lisa stood amidst the chaos, her transformation complete. Pripyat was no longer just a city, it was alive, its cursed energy embodied in Lisa. The mutants knelt before her, their queen, as the reactor's final explosion sealed the city off once more. Weeks later, a new group of tourists ventured too close to the exclusion zone, lured by rumors of strange lights and ghostly figures. As they crossed the border into Pripyat, they were greeted by Lisa's haunting smile. The new group of tourists, led by a reckless guide named Pavel, arrived at the edge of Pripyat, their excitement mingled with unease as the twisted skyline loomed over them. Rusted Ferris wheels and crumbling apartments bore silent witness to the horrors that lurked within. Despite rumors of disappearances, Pavel assured them the stories were just urban legends to keep adventurers away. As the group delved deeper into the city, the air grew heavier, laced with an acrid stench of decay. Unnerved but curious, they stumbled upon grotesque displays, skeletal remains posed in macabre tableaus, symbols carved into their bones. The tourists hesitated, but Pavel brushed it off as a morbid prank by other explorers. That night, the group camped in a decrepit school, their laughter masking the encroaching dread. But the silence outside grew oppressive. Then came the sounds, scraping metal. Whispers too faint to understand, and faint footsteps circling the building. When one tourist, Elena, ventured outside to investigate. She vanished into the darkness. The group found her hours later, her body nailed to the gymnasium wall. Her eyes had been gouged out, her chest sliced open to reveal her still beating heart, surrounded by carved symbols glowing faintly green. The shock paralyzed them until a guttural growl from the shadows snapped them into action. Attacked in waves, their glowing eyes and disfigured forms illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning. Screams filled the air as one tourist, Alexei, was dragged into the building's basement. The others, desperate to save him, followed the echoes of his cries, only to find him bound to a rusted operating table. His captors flayed him alive, their grotesque faces twisting in sadistic glee as they harvested pieces of his flesh. The survivors fled, but Pripyat itself seemed to conspire against them. Streets warped into labyrinths, doors slammed shut on their own, and radioactive fog swallowed their path. One by one, they fell into the traps laid by the mutants. Ivan tripped a crude snare, his body impaled on a bed of rusted spikes. Maria found herself in a room filled with decaying gas masks. As she reached for one, hands shot out from the darkness, dragging her into a pit where the mutants feasted on her alive. The remaining survivors, Pavel and Dmitri, found themselves in the reactor core, where Lisa awaited them. Her transformation was complete, her once human form now radiated malevolent energy. The mutants knelt before her throne of human remains as she watched the intruders with cold detachment. Lisa's voice echoed in their minds, a cacophony of rage and despair. "You should have never come here," she said, her words laced with venom. "This city belongs to the damned. And you will join them." Dmitri attempted to reason with her, but Lisa's eyes flared with radioactive fury. With a flick of her hand, the mutants descended upon him. They tore at his flesh, each piece ripped away with agonizing precision, leaving him alive just long enough to feel every moment of his dismemberment. Pavel, horrified but determined to survive, made a desperate attempt to destroy the reactor. Using a stolen Geiger counter, he set off an alarm, drawing the mutants' attention. In the chaos, he ignited a makeshift explosive, hoping to collapse. The explosion was deafening, sending chunks of debris flying through the air. The mutants howled in agony, their twisted bodies disintegrating in the radioactive inferno. But Lisa remained standing, her form now glowing with otherworldly power. "You cannot destroy what is eternal," she hissed, her voice reverberating through the crumbling structure. Pavel tried to flee, but Lisa's energy surged through the ruins, trapping him. She approached him slowly, her grotesque smile widening. With a single touch, she forced his body to convulse, the radiation rapidly deforming his flesh. His screams echoed as his body twisted into one of the very creatures he had tried to destroy. The reactor burned for days. But the mutants rebuilt, their queen stronger than ever. Lisa's reign over Pripyat was unchallenged, her presence a warning to all who dared enter. Far away, stories of glowing lights and whispers in the exclusion zone began circulating again. A new group of thrill-seekers prepared for an expedition, lured by the promise of adventure. Months passed, and the exclusion zone remained eerily silent. Officials dismissed the stories of glowing lights and strange occurrences, attributing them to overactive imaginations. But in the shadow of Pripyat, whispers of the horrors persisted. The city's curse continued to fester, claiming more victims who ventured too close. One day, a mercenary group was hired by a private firm with a covert agenda, to retrieve anomalous artifacts from the heart of the exclusion zone. The team, hardened and heavily armed, believed they were prepared for anything. Their mission was straightforward: secure samples and return. But as they approached Pripyat, the Geiger counters began screaming, and an oppressive sense of dread settled over them. The team set up camp on the outskirts of the city. Captain Orlov, their leader, dismissed the eerie silence as psychological, but his second, Anton, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, one of their men, Kolya, vanished during his shift. His screams echoed from the shadows, but when the team followed, they found nothing except his severed hand hanging from a street lamp, clutching a bloody note scrawled with Cyrillic symbols. The group pressed on, unwilling to abandon their mission. They found strange artifacts, twisted metal objects pulsing faintly with an unnatural energy, scattered throughout the ruins. Each piece seemed to hum with an invisible force that made their skin crawl. But every step deeper into the city brought new horrors. They stumbled upon a building filled with mutated remains displayed like grotesque art. One body, still twitching, was nailed to the wall, its mouth sewn shut. The walls were covered in cryptic carvings, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Before the group could investigate further, they were ambushed by the mutants. The attack was swift and brutal. One soldier, Yuri, was dragged into an alley. His screams turned to gurgles as the mutants peeled his skin away layer by layer, their laughter echoing in the night. Another, Sergei, tried to run but triggered a trap, a wire loop that tightened around his neck and hoisted him into the air. The group could only watch as the mutants disemboweled him, leaving his entrails strung up like decorations. Captain Orlov led the remaining team into an abandoned hospital, hoping to regroup. But the hospital was no refuge. They found themselves in a labyrinth of blood-stained halls, where the mutants played with their prey. One soldier was separated and found himself locked in a room filled with medical equipment. The mutants restrained him on a table and performed a sadistic surgery, slicing open his chest and sewing objects into his body. Meanwhile, Anton discovered the truth behind the artifacts. In the depths of the hospital's basement, he found a journal belonging to a long-dead writings detailed experiments conducted after the disaster, attempts to harness the reactor's radiation to create a new form of life. The experiments had failed, but the survivors of Pripyat had mutated into something far worse. Bound to the city by the radiation that sustained them, the team's numbers dwindled until only Orlov and Anton remained. They made their way to the reactor, hoping to destroy it and end the mutants' reign. The closer they got, the more the city seemed to fight back. The ground split open, spewing radioactive sludge. The air became thick with whispers, each one speaking their darkest fears. At the reactor, they found Lisa, now a monstrous queen ruling over the mutants. Her body radiated energy, and her voice was a haunting echo. She revealed that the artifacts were fragments of her power, left as lures to draw more victims into Pripyat. Orlov charged at Lisa, firing his weapon, but the bullets disintegrated before reaching her. She raised her hand, and Orlov's body twisted unnaturally, his bones snapping as he was lifted into the air. With a sickening crack, his spine shattered, and his lifeless body fell to the ground. Anton, now alone, set the explosives on the reactor. Lisa taunted him, her voice invading his mind, showing him visions of his own death. As he activated the timer, the mutants swarmed him. They tore at his flesh, dragging him to Lisa's throne. She smiled as she placed her hand on his forehead, and his screams filled the reactor chamber. The timer reached 0, and the explosion engulfed the room in fire and radiation. When the smoke cleared, Pripyat remained. The city was scarred but alive, its horrors. Pripyat smoldered, the air reeked of burnt flesh and ozone. But beneath the reactor's ruins, in a secret chamber long buried by time, Lisa's mutilated body stirred. The explosion had not destroyed her but instead unlocked her true potential. Her mutated form, now grotesquely elegant, pulsed with raw radioactive energy. Her lips curved into a sinister smile. She was no longer bound by the reactor. Elsewhere, a private military convoy rolled into the exclusion zone. A covert multinational corporation had been monitoring Pripyat, waiting for the right moment to strike. The mercenary team, led by the cold and calculating commander Viktor Arkov, had one mission: retrieve Lisa. They believed her mutated DNA held the key to creating the ultimate biological weapon. The new team entered Pripyat under the cover of darkness. Equipped with state-of-the-art tech and biohazard suits, they thought they were untouchable. But Pripyat had evolved. The mutants, more feral and coordinated after Lisa's rebirth, watched silently from the shadows. The mercenaries moved with precision, clearing buildings and setting traps. They discovered grotesque remains of the previous victims, entire families twisted into artful displays of agony. One soldier found a wall covered in still-breathing skin, faces embedded within it, their muffled screams filling the room. Things took a darker turn when the mutants attacked. These were no longer disorganized hunters, they moved like a hive mind. guided by Lisa's will. The first casualty was brutal. Sergeant Kirill was dragged into a collapsed basement. When the team found him minutes later, he was still alive, his body stripped of skin, every nerve ending exposed. His rasping cries for mercy were silenced when a mutant twisted his head 180 degrees, the sound of cracking bones echoing through the ruins. Commander Arkov pressed on, guided by intelligence that suggested the reactor's core was merely beneath the city. They found an underground facility, a Soviet-era laboratory abandoned after the meltdown. Inside, they uncovered horrifying experiments, preserved mutant embryos floating in vats, human test subjects fused with machinery, and journals documenting attempts to weaponize radiation. Among the documents, they discovered a shocking twist. Lisa had been part of the experiments even before the meltdown. She wasn't a random victim, she was created. A scientist, desperate to save his dying daughter, had exposed her to experimental radiation therapy. The meltdown accelerated her transformation, turning her into a monstrous queen. Lisa made her presence known, broadcasting her voice into their minds. You came to steal my power. Now, you'll become part of it. The mercenaries were picked off one by one in increasingly horrific ways. Corporal Ilyana was caught in a trap, a series of hanging chains laced with razor-sharp blades. As she struggled, the chains tightened, slicing her into pieces. Her screams were deafening, but her comrades could do nothing but watch as the mutants carried off her remains. Lieutenant Sokolov was dragged into a room lined with mirrors. His reflection began to move independently, showing him the deaths of his teammates before turning on him. The glass shattered, and shards pierced his body, pinning him like a grotesque butterfly in a collector's case. The survivors realized Lisa wasn't just hunting them, she was transforming them. The mutants weren't mindless, they were soldiers created from those who dared to trespass. Each victim was reshaped, their agony fueling their rebirth. Arkov and his remaining men made a desperate dash for the surface, but the labyrinthine tunnels twisted around them. Hallways looped back on themselves, and familiar landmarks disappeared. Lisa's laughter echoed, mocking their futility. When they finally emerged, they found the city alive in a new way. The radiation had caused the very buildings to mutate, walls bleeding and streets shifting like quicksand. Lisa had merged with Pripyat itself, her power extending far beyond her physical form. Arkov, desperate and injured, activated a failsafe, a nuclear device meant to erase Pripyat from existence. But as he tried to detonate it, Lisa appeared, her form now a towering, radiant figure of death. You cannot destroy me, she whispered, her voice a symphony of despair. I am this city. She revealed the ultimate twist. The mercenaries' employer had never intended for them to succeed. The mission was a diversion to lure Lisa into full power. The corporation had implanted trackers in the team, ensuring that every death fueled Lisa's growth. As Lisa absorbed the last of Arkov's men, she turned to the camera feeds broadcasting the mission to the corporation. Her face, monstrous yet hauntingly beautiful, filled the screens. You wanted a weapon, she hissed. Now, come claim it. With a burst of radioactive energy, she sent a pulse through the monitors, infecting the outside world with her curse. Cities far from Pripyat began experiencing unexplainable phenomena, buildings collapsing, people mutating, whispers of Lisa's name in the wind. Pripyat became a global quarantine zone, but it was too late. Lisa's influence spread like a virus. Lisa's army of mutants now surrounded the reactor's epicenter, a living, breathing nightmare of grotesque forms, each twisted and enhanced by radioactive energy. Her influence had spread like a virus, not only within Pripyat but into the minds of those beyond its borders. The few surviving mercenaries were nothing more than pawns in her larger plan. Commander Arkov, battered and barely clinging to life, stumbled into the core chamber, where the original reactor meltdown had occurred. The room was a surreal hellscape, walls pulsating as if alive, glowing veins of radiation coursing through them. At the center sat Lisa, her mutated form now transcendent, a fusion of human and cosmic horror. Glowing with an unholy brilliance, Arkov had one last trick up his sleeve. Beneath his suit was a fail-safe mechanism, a miniaturized nuclear warhead implanted into his chest, designed to detonate upon his death. If he could get close enough to Lisa, he could end it all, but at the cost of his life. Lisa, sensing his plan, smiled mockingly. "Do you think I didn't foresee this, Commander? You are predictable, like all those who came before you." As Arkov approached, Lisa revealed the ultimate twist: he had been part of her plan all along. The corporation he worked for had been manipulating him from the start. They knew he would lead her to full power, and his death would provide the final burst of energy she needed to complete her transformation. "Your sacrifice is not noble," Lisa hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. "It is inevitable." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The mutants outside howled in unison as Lisa extended her arms, her energy intertwining with the reactor itself. The chamber began to morph, the walls collapsing into a vortex of light and shadow. Lisa wasn't just becoming a god of Pripyat, she was turning the entire city into a living entity, a monstrous hive mind capable of Arkov, knowing he had seconds left, lunged toward her. But as he activated the warhead, Lisa's hand shot out, gripping his throat. She didn't kill him, instead, she showed him everything. In a flash, Arkov saw the corporation's true motives. They had never intended to stop Lisa. They wanted to harness her, to weaponize her in Pripyat as the ultimate deterrent. The lives lost, the horrors unleashed, were all calculated sacrifices. And Arkov had been their puppet. "You were never the hero," Lisa whispered, her glowing eyes piercing his soul. "You were always the fool." Arkov's bomb began to beep, signaling its imminent detonation. Lisa, unfazed, let him fall to the ground. "Detonate if you must," she said. "But it will only serve me." But Arkov had one final twist. He hadn't just armed the bomb, he had linked it to a remote satellite carrying experimental EMP technology. Designed to shut down nuclear reactors, the satellite could disrupt Lisa's energy field long enough to destroy her. As he activated the device with his last breath, Lisa's expression shifted from smug confidence to rage. The EMP pulse hit Pripyat like a wave, silencing the howls of the mutants and severing Lisa's connection to the reactor. Lisa screamed, her body flickering like a dying flame. "You think this will stop me? I am eternal." But Arkov, grinning through bloodied teeth, muttered, "Eternity ends here." The warhead detonated, and the explosion was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The core chamber collapsed inward, consuming Lisa, the mutants, and the reactor in a vortex of light. The blast spread outward, incinerating everything within the exclusion zone but leaving no radiation, only silence. The world watched as satellite feeds showed Pripyat vanish into a crater, a blackened scar where the city once stood. The corporation's plans were destroyed, their experiments exposed, and their influence. Months later, Pripyat became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of humanity's hubris. The area was declared permanently uninhabitable, fenced off and monitored by military forces. But rumors persisted, of shadows moving in the ruins, of whispers on the wind. In a classified report buried deep within government archives, one entry stood out: "Subject Lisa remains unaccounted for. Energy signatures detected outside the exclusion zone. Potential threat level, catastrophic." And somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the world, a young girl stared into a broken mirror. Behind her, Lisa's reflection smiled.